Welcome back, fellow armchair generals. This is Gamer 1745 here with my continuing playthrough of Hearts of Iron 4 with Black Ice. Okay, we're continuing here. Playing as Japan, got a little more organized. The name I was looking for the other day was the Kwang Tung Army. That was sort of the army in Manchuria that expanded forward into China. I organized up all the islands just under the Pacific Theater, and then that's Nihon, which is another way of saying Japan. Army for sort of the home army, if you will. Couldn't quickly find if they called it the home army or how it was organized. Okay, Five Ministers Conference. The Five Ministers Conference was a meeting between 5 important Japanese ministers in which they laid out a plan for Japanese expansion. It was decided to expand southwards into China and other parts of Asia. The Soviet Union was not ignored, however, and part of the plan was also to build a large enough army to be able to defeat the Soviet Union. Foreign Minister Arita generally approved of the plan, but stressed the importance of maintaining goodwill of the United Kingdom and the United States. Prime Minister Hirota agreed with the plan and decided to let the Army or Navy draw up a detailed plan. Okay, this is a very important decision to make. It affects this, which unlocks. So if you want to do the southern expansion, it unlocks this focus tree here, or if you want to let the army draw it up, you have this tree. So you need to understand where you're going to want to go. Now there's a lot of good things here, because I looked when I played through this before I quickly looked through some of these. A lot of good military factories, infrastructure improvements, more infrastructure, naval bases to help supply, research bonuses, all very good. Begin build up sort of proper, and go into Army aviation. Now this is the southern expansion. Basically a little more background, and I really don't know much about the Five Ministers Conference, quite honestly, other than what I've read here. There was, but we can call it a border war. It was more than just skirmishing, but there was real fighting between the Japanese and the Soviet army in the Far East. Basically, the Soviets did rather well. The Japanese were repulsed. And you have to remember, I may be mistaken, but to the best of my knowledge, even at this time, the railway across the Soviet Union to Vladivostok was not complete at this time. So you could not get on a train in Moscow and get over to here. You had to, I think, take a ferry across Lake Baikal, so that there was no rail connection. Eventually this happened, and I'm not exactly sure when, and I may be off, but it was, the Great Railway that went all the way across didn't. So you had to, wherever the railhead, I believe on one side of Lake Baikal, you had to unload, put onto ferries, and this is a pretty big lake, very, very deep lake, in fact, and take the ferry shipments across the lake, put them back on trains, and I do believe they even had some ships. Ferries these are big ferries, basically ships. I think they had some that you could actually roll railway cars onto, and then roll them off on the other side. So it wasn't quite entirely primitive, but it was still a need to load and unload. And I don't think there are that many ferries, in the sense that if you had 20 100 car trains zipping across the Russian steppes going east carrying large numbers of army soldiers and equipment and tanks and artillery and all this stuff. They couldn't, there wasn't enough ships to like roll them all on and efficiently. It really was a major slowing blocking point. And there was some others. I know the Czechs, the Czech Legion, which was formed from mostly, almost entirely, Austrian prisoners of war from World War I, but of Czech extraction, that joined the Russian army to fight against Austria. They did make their grand march across the east and, well, basically on the railways and fought their way through the Bolsheviks and through Vladivostok and got out that way. But, and I think they used some, the ferry system, so you could, but that was still a major arduous journey that went on. So there still wasn't a massive rapid response going back and forth. Now we did see when in December of 41, with the winter coming on, the Russian winter offensive, or was it January? I don't know, I forget the exact date, against, counteroffensive against the Germans, was basically the post buildup of the border skirmishes with a lot of the T-34s in the east by Stalin. They did move them west, but it took them a while to get there. I mean, the Germans got, to right about there at the tip of their spearhead to Moscow, and could sort of see the spires of Moscow off in the distance when they started to get pushed back. So it took them all that time to move that over. So Japan, obviously, if you the Sino-Russian War, popping in my head, in 1905, between Japan and not Sino, Sino's China, Japo-Russian War, whatever it was called, that happened here. So the Japanese had fought. They acquired Port Arthur down here from the Russians, and some other territory in that. So they had fought the Russians before. They were very unsure when they pushed up what kind of effectiveness the Soviets were going to have in this, and they got pushed back pretty heavily. So this is what really showed the Japanese that if they were going to go for war against the Soviets, they weren't just going to say defeat outpost troops. Like, good examples would be, the U.S. troops garrisoning the Philippines with some local troops, British garrisoning Hong Kong, British garrisoning Malaya. Now, remember the defenders of Singapore, which were attacked by the Japanese, outnumbered the Japanese that defeated them. It was almost a bluff by the Japanese, and the Japanese had defeated and captured fairly large amounts of British and Commonwealth troops as they moved down Malaya as well. So there was considerable forces, but they were, and this was obviously once World War II was going and they're fighting in North Africa, but this was still outpost European forces. The Soviets turned out to be stronger than that. I don't quite know if all of these divisional units may be a bit overdoing it, but it was enough that it wasn't going to be an easy, quick victory where they can march, cut the railways or what here at Lake Baikal, and hold that and sort of secure this northeastern. A lot of this was very undeveloped. Now, obviously, it wasn't as big as it appears here because, the map projection, going towards the pole, North Pole up there, of course. But there was a fair amount of resources, and the Japanese thought that they could exploit a lot of that. I don't think the Japanese never dreamed of getting to Moscow. They knew they weren't going to get it. I doubt that they really thought they'd get even past here at some point. they thought they might. That's why they had the border skirmishes to test the Soviets, and the Soviets were a bit more difficult than they had thought. So, just so you understand, that's sort of the historical background and the choice we're making here. My plan with this series is definitely to take out China and do aggressive moves into the Pacific when I feel we're capable of doing this. I don't want to do the sort of, oh, let's hit the national focus to go to war over the Dutch East Indies. Well, great, yeah, but we have no troops to invade, no ability to invade. I want to try to only, if you will, go to aggressive war against various Western allies when we were able to deal with it. Now, they did mention stress the importance of maintaining the goodwill of the United Kingdom and the United States. Remember, during World War I, Japan was on the Allied side. They basically did so to pick up all of these islands out here, garrisoning of them. Those were part of the German colonial empire, and this part of what here is Australia was also part of the German colonial empire that the Australians ended up picking up. That's why Japan was interested in going into the war. So they had a fairly long, fairly good relationship with the British even before that, in modernizing and developing their navy. They defeated the Russians, which is the Tsushima Straits here, when Russia sent a fleet all the way around, Africa and everything to get over here. Great feat for the Russians, but just sort of at the last, near the goal. The Japanese defeated it at that, and that was significantly, I believe, because of training, technical advice, and all kinds of things like that developed by the British for the Japanese. So that they did have a good relationship with them. I don't think at its core Japan had such an anti-European colonial vision that they developed during this time period. Also before this, right around 1900 or so, when the 55 Days of Peking movie starring Charlton Heston, you may remember, during the Boxer Rebellion, maybe it was 1895 or something like this, they landed, I think, was this Tinsin or, no, yeah, this is, I think, the Tinsin here, where they landed. And part of the international force was the Japanese that did this. So Japan had been having a cooperative view with European powers in carving up trade zones in China and other things. So I don't think there was really this great mindset of we got to stop the colonial powers to return power to the Asian people. I think that was more of a propaganda viewpoint. They just wanted to exploit the locals, but tried to do that. It was only particularly America's boycott that pushed them in conflict with America, and as I said, talked in the earlier episodes about Japan's desire for natural resources, and which there weren't many critical resources in the Philippines, but it was seen as a vulnerability to have a potential major enemy base right in your shipping lines. That's why they went after the Philippines. They wanted to get down here to get secure here. So it was only with the defeats of France, particularly, does Europe start to look weak enough that Japan would openly look at confronting them. We are going to anticipate, I guess theoretically it's possible, but I doubt it. Germany may be peaceful and Europe may be all peaceful, so if we tried to start a world war ourselves, we get crushed. But I anticipate the war starting at some point. So we're going to open the southern expansion focus tree. As you can see now, we can start doing that. We go through various naval expansions for dockyard and productions. Okay, let's see now. We finally have a minister here that we can do. Devoted royalist. Who that is. That's the wrong picture for the guy. He didn't have a mustache. Chayuni Sugihara. He's a very interesting guy. We'll talk about him sometime. Okay, we're going to go with silent workhorse, I think. There are no production ministers because we do not have my Japanese minister mod added here, which there are various good ones. So, and they have announced that Japan does get a production bonus minister to help them in the next expansion for Hearts of Iron. But we're going to go to Mitsumasa Yonai here because we want the political power gain to help this long term, and we want to get it as early as possible. Okay, the Summer Olympics. More production availability for shipping. Okay. Let's focus it there. Get them done quicker. Okay, we now have the Spanish Civil War blossoming. Okay, we're smaller shipment of armored cars. Okay, so motorcycles from Italy. Are they Vespas? Sorry, I don't know any other Italian motorcycle companies. Then the Vespa might not be. Okay, do we want to do an artillery deal with who? German Reich. Okay, they want some of our artillery. Okay, our artillery doesn't come up to anywhere nearly as good as theirs, but whatever. The Black Ice does some sort of partisan spawning events or something, and I tried a game for a while with Germany, and it was a bit odd. As Podcat recently announced, he's done some rebalancing of the Spanish Civil War to make it work much more historical. So it should be getting better. I can say that much. Okay, so we have anti-aircraft guns. Those are going to be our sort of cheap anti-tank artillery. These for a while. Fighters, or fighter techniques. I think this will do us for most of the army. Maybe we'll need a Southeast Command. It's really interesting to watch the patterns of history. To understand World War II, you have to understand World War I. But even if you're looking at the Pacific theater, you have to understand, shall we say, 19th century expansion into China, the collapse of the Manchus, with the Boxer rebellions, and how Japan, in the latter half of the 19th century, you've maybe seen the movie Last Samurai starring Tom Cruise or whatever, they're moved from a feudal world that banned firearms. You know, firearms are basically banned in Japan, and the Japanese firearms that did sort of exist were matchlock muskets, literally into the 19th century, were and matchlock pistols, and things like that. To move from that in what was post-American Civil War, I think the 1870s, to right around 1900 or so, they're 1905, whatever it was, they're fighting a war with Russia, and they've got pre-dreadnought most assuredly, but battleships fighting Imperial Russian battleships and kicking the Russian battleships' asses here in that short of a time period. And you know, in the earlier episodes, I talked about how different countries organize up their society and how they changed, and Japan definitely moves to a modern technological society, still at this time period, with their extreme reverence for the emperor and other things. I wouldn't quite call it a modern cultural society. Nowadays they are in a modern cultural society, but it is not a Western society. It is, I have never been there, but like I said, I've studied the language and known a bunch of Japanese and fairly familiar with it. It is not a Western culture. They do love our music because of American occupation, love the baseball. But if you look at the way they enjoy baseball and the way they play baseball, they bring in a few American ringers, mostly minor league level players that do very well in Japan, and they sort of have to somewhat conform and get to the Japanese way of playing as sort of the team sport. And it's a, if you were to be sort of like an A-Rod and whatever, sort of be the big guy who sticks out, they'd hate you in Japan. It's all for the team. It's a very different world view, but it's a modern world view, but it's not a Western world view. It's very different than that. So, you know, and just the way they've changed and organized their society up to get to now, it's a poor man's level of industrialization. Let's get this one. And since we have a few more, let's, you know, okay, Mitsui. Okay, what's this? Magazine fort raid. The IRA has raided a magazine fort in Dublin, although they had managed to mostly seize Irish munitions. They were reclaimed very shortly after. Many IRA volunteers were caught and arrested. Okay, I don't know why this is being reported to us in Japan. Okay, so now we have the Southern Doctrine in 70 days. Here we have the expanded shipyards and shipyard expansion. Truck Lagoon, that we very well may eventually want to do some of these naval base expansions and get amphibious warfare improved. We also have naval doctrine research things that will help out. This southern expansion, which will allow gain conquer focus against the United Kingdom, excuse me, in the Netherlands, but we're going to wait for that one until we are sort of ready to head that way and get demand into China and similar things once we're ready. But currently, we could do the artillery, of course, but what we want to do is continue to expand our dockyards and our civil factories. So, let's see now. What do is there something that we are not producing that we need to produce? Those are just, okay. We need more naval bombers for our expanded carriers, and we could use some more light utility and such. Okay, let's port equipment. Now we have 4 more things. And I do want to put these into production. Let's increase this by 1. And our support equipment. Let's try to catch up to our needs there at least. But so Japan moving from their feudal society into their industrialized society, it was nowhere near the depth of industrialization as, say, Britain, France, or Germany, or as widespread. There wasn't the idea like cars for everyone. There were still lots of animal transports and things like that. And you get outside of some of the major cities at this time, in the 30s, you're starting to go, you know, fairly primitive. You know, a lot of people today, as pointed out, do you conceive of houses without running water or electricity? Trust me, in many, many small towns, there would be the great majority of the houses without what we would think as modern running water. They may have had a tap somewhere in there, but the idea, you know, the Japanese obviously had their significant bath culture, but, and not that there was zero running water in some of the small towns, it's fairly easy to do, but the idea of piping it through all of the houses and all of the, you know, in the city and all that, that just was not going on at this time. And the idea that every house had electricity, or even most houses had electricity in Japan, I don't think was the case. Now, I'm not saying that big cities like Tokyo that wasn't the case. I'm talking more provincially and getting outside of the main areas from my understanding of Japan. So it wasn't quite the depth of industrialization that we think of it as. And if you looked at their production needs, their production capabilities or whatever, it clearly shows that they had no business of going to war with any major power, including Britain or France. Britain or France, either one of them, if it didn't have to deal with the rest of World War II, you know, if it was just, you know, everyone else is at peace, but France versus Japan, France is going to kick Japan's ass. Now, maybe the first fleet, like the Russians, would send over the French fleet might be too battleship intensive, and Japan uses its carriers and sinks it all. But France's shipbuilding capacity could easily have caught up and overwhelmed Japan's, you know, if it didn't have any other worries, if it was just looking at Japan's needs. So that's sort of how we're going to have to play this. We're going to play this opportunistically and carefully, and not just, well, it's December 41, so we must go to war with the U.S. No, we're going to be very careful. Okay. RAND battle plan. Yes, defense organization. We like that. So we're going to try to get China knocked down and get that, and try to find trade partners who will trade with us, as well as, like we just did, expand our own resource extraction. Okay, let's see. Get some carrier primacy going. I think there's another. Imperial austerity, synthetic oil focuses. Need to do that. I think there's another, but I may be mistaken. Another resort. Oh, here, this one gets us another research slot. That's okay. Okay, infantry guns, great. So we got infantry guns. Well, at least from the movies, the Japanese were known for their sniping, so we're going to go with sniping to help improve our. It improves defense for all infantry and motor and mech. So that will help our war width. Well, we're going to end the episode here. Thanks so much for watching. Thanks for liking the videos, of course. Really do appreciate that. And please post questions, comments, suggestions, and ideas. And I do, if you know historical dates or something, please do post them. I'm just doing this off of memory, so if somebody knows it better, I would like the stuff down below for posterity's sake so that people can quickly look it up to do that. So if you want to add those kinds of things, I do appreciate it. See you next time for more Hearts of Iron.